I came home from war to find my sister in my bed. So, I destroyed her life. I watched my husband kiss my sister over my own open grave, their tears as fake as the death certificate they used to drain my life's work. They thought a remote medical mission in a war zone had swallowed me whole, leaving my fortune for their greedy hands to pluck. They are about to learn that you never declare a neurosurgeon dead until you've checked the pulse yourself, and mine is beating with pure, cold fire. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It haunted. It was a cold, needle-sharp drizzle that soaked through my tactical jacket as I stood at the iron gates of my own estate. For 14 months, I had been off the grid, performing high-stakes neurosurgery in a classified black site hospital in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan. I had survived mortar fire, a kidnapping attempt, and a bout of typhus that should have killed a lesser woman. I had stayed alive for one reason: to come home to the glass and steel sanctuary I had built with my own sweat and brilliance. I reached for the biometric scanner hidden behind the stone pillar. My thumb pressed against the glass. Access denied. A cold, synthetic voice chirped. A red light blinked like a dying eye. I frowned, the muscle memory of a surgeon, precise and calm. Kicking in, I tried again. Unauthorized user, the system stated. I stepped back, my boots crunching on the wet gravel. This was my house. I had designed the security software myself. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who don't have a plan. I walked the perimeter of the tall cedar fence until I reached the service entrance. There, sitting in the mud next to a row of overflowing industrial bins, was a pile of black contractor bags. One of them had split open. I knelt, the dampness seeping into my knees. Inside the bag wasn't trash. It was my life. My custom-made surgical loops, worth $20,000, lay crushed under a pile of old newspapers. My doctoral degree from Johns Hopkins, the frame shattered, was stained with coffee grounds. And there, at the bottom, was the silk scarf my mother had left me before she died, now used to wipe up what looked like motor oil. My heart rate didn't spike, it dropped. It became a steady, predatory rhythm. In the medical field, we call it the God complex, the ability to remain detached while everything around you is bleeding out. The front doors of the mansion swung open. The warm, golden light of the foyer spilled onto the wet driveway, illuminating two figures. Julian, my husband of 6 years, stepped out. He looked radiant, wearing a cashmere sweater I hadn't seen before, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand. Beside him was Beatrice, my younger half-sister. She was draped in a silk robe that I recognized instantly. It was mine, a gift from a grateful patient in Dubai. "Julian," I called out, my voice a low, dangerous rasp. They both froze. Julian's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the designer tile. Beatrice let out a thin, strangled yelp, clutching the lapels of my robe. "Vesper," Julian stammered, his face turning the color of curdled milk. You're supposed to be dead." "I've been told I'm a difficult patient," I said, walking slowly into the light. I didn't stop until I was at the foot of the stairs looking up at them. Why is the biometric lock rejecting my print? And why is my mother's scarf in a trash bag? Julian recovered faster than I expected. He stepped forward, his eyes darting to Beatrice, then back to me. A mask of faux grief settled over his features. "Vesper, thank God. We received a report from the State Department. An explosion at the site. They found your ID tags near a localized blast. There was a death certificate issued 4 months ago. And the death certificate gave you permission to throw my surgical equipment in the garbage?" I asked, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. "We had to move on, Vesper." Beatrice piped up, her voice regaining its usual entitled whine. "The house was a mausoleum. Julian was a wreck. We had to settle the estate. You left him everything in the event of your passing, remember?" I looked at her, the golden child, who had flunked out of 3 different colleges on my tuition payments. "I remember a will. I don't remember an invitation for you to move into my bedroom. Julian cleared his throat, his posture straightening. The cowardice was being replaced by a slick, legalistic arrogance. Actually, Vesper, it wasn't just the will. Before you left, you signed that medical and financial power of attorney. Given the circumstances of your presumed death and the subsequent legal filings, the deed has been transferred. The estate is settled. Technically, you don't own this house anymore. Beatrice and we've made a new start. The law is the law, Julian said, his voice gaining strength. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. You look terrible, Vesper. Ragged. Unstable. Maybe the war changed you. You should leave before I call the police. You're trespassing on private property. I stared at him, the man I had saved from bankruptcy twice, the man I had thought was my partner. He wasn't looking at a wife, he was looking at an obstacle to his new lifestyle. I looked at Beatrice, who was smirking now, tucked under his arm. They had planned this. They hadn't just waited for me to die, they had celebrated it. You're right, Julian, I said, my voice eerily calm. I do look terrible, but appearances can be surgically altered. Character, however, is terminal. I turned on my heel and walked back into the rain. I didn't look back. I heard the heavy oak door thud shut, the deadbolt clicking into place, a sound that meant they thought they had won. I got into my mud-splatter rental SUV and sat in the dark. My hands were perfectly still. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a burner phone I'd kept for emergencies. I dialed a number that wasn't in any public directory. This is Dr. Thorne, I said when the line picked up. The patient has a malignant tumor. It's deep and it's spreading. I need the specialized theater. And I need the heavy sedation. Welcome back, doctor, a gravelly voice replied. Are we operating? No, I said, watching the lights of my house flicker in the rearview mirror. We're performing an autopsy, and the patients are still awake. I drove away, the plan already forming in my mind like a complex neurological map. They thought they had used a piece of paper to erase me. They forgot that I spent my life navigating the most intricate systems in the human body. I knew how to sever a nerve so cleanly the victim didn't know they were paralyzed until they tried to walk. Julian and Beatrice wanted my life? Fine. I would let them have it, until the weight of it crushed every bone in their bodies. I wasn't just a doctor anymore. I was the consequence of their greed. By the time I reached a secluded motel 10 miles away, I had already initiated the first phase. I logged into an encrypted server, bypassing the death certificate, blocks they had placed on my primary accounts. They hadn't realized that my true wealth wasn't in the bank accounts they had drained. It was in the offshore clinical patents and the gray sector consulting fees they didn't even know existed. I stared at the screen as the data began to flow. I saw Julian's recent spending, a Lamborghini, a beach house in Tulum, and a series of consulting fees paid to a shady medical board. My eyes narrowed. A medical board? Why would a failed architect be paying a medical board? I clicked deeper. I found the file. It wasn't just a death certificate. Julian had filed a declaration of mental incompetence in absentia 2 months before the death report arrived. He had used a forged psychiatric evaluation, claiming I had suffered a psychotic break before my deployment. He hadn't just stolen my house. He had attempted to lobotomize my reputation so that even if I did return, I would be nothing more than a ward of the state. I leaned back against the thin, polyester pillow of the motel bed. A cold, predatory smile touched my lips. You should have made sure I was in the casket, Julian, I whispered to the empty room. Because now, I'm the one with the scalpel. The fluorescent light in the motel bathroom flickered with a rhythmic, dying hum, casting long, skeletal shadows against the peeling yellow wallpaper. I stood before the cracked mirror, not looking at my face, but at the scars on my shoulder, reminders of a mortar blast in Kyrgyzstan that had nearly ended me. They thought I was a ghost. Fine. A ghost is the perfect assassin because you never see it coming until the room turns cold. In the military-grade laptop humming on the bed, I watched the digital heartbeat of my enemies. As a neurosurgeon who consulted for high-level intelligence agencies, I didn't just know anatomy, I knew systems. And every system has a carotid artery. I reached for the keyboard. My fingers, steady enough to reattach a microscopic nerve, moved with a different kind of precision now. Following the tactical blueprint I had developed in the shadows of war zones, I initiated Phase 1, the total financial infarction. In the sources, I recalled how a power of attorney was meant to protect, not to plunder. Julian had used the one I signed in a moment of misplaced trust to bleed me dry. He thought he was playing a clever game of chess. He didn't realize I had already flipped the board. Login, Thorn_Vesper_Alpha. I whispered. With 4 keystrokes, I accessed the central hub of our joint estate. I didn't just change passwords. I flagged the accounts for high-level federal fraud review. Using my security clearance, I triggered a national security hold on every credit card, every offshore investment, and the massive trust fund my father had left me. In an instant, the golden tap that Julian and Beatrice were drinking from didn't just stop dripping, it vanished. I sat back, watching the red, locked icons populate the screen. I could almost hear the silence that was about to hit my mansion. 2 hours later, the first vibration hit my burner phone.
Julian.
I didn't answer. I watched the notification light blink like a frantic heartbeat. Then came the text. Vesper, what did you do? The card was declined at the dealership. I'm standing here like an idiot with a brand new Porsche and no way to pay. 5 minutes later, Beatrice is panicking. The house staff just walked out because the payroll account is frozen. Answer me. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. In the sources, the golden child brother, Leo, had been left humiliated at a steakhouse. I wanted Julian to feel that same public castration. I wanted him to stand in that high-end dealership, surrounded by the scent of Italian leather and judgment, realizing that the woman he tried to bury still held the leash. But the financial strike was only the beginning. I needed to address the declaration of mental incompetence. I drove through the rain to a secluded office in the suburbs of North Seattle. This wasn't a law firm with mahogany desks and silk rugs. This was the office of Silas Vance, a retired military investigator who specialized in cleaning up messes that the regular police wouldn't touch. You look like you've been through a meat grinder, Doc, Silas said, sliding a folder across the desk. The room smelled of stale coffee and gunpowder. I've been in one, I replied, opening the folder. Who signed the psych evaluation? A man named Dr. Sterling Graves. Silas spat the name out like it was rotten meat. A strip mall psychiatrist with a gambling debt the size of a small moon. Julian paid him $50,000 to sign a paper saying you were suffering from acute combat-induced psychosis and permanent cognitive dissociation. It's a beautiful piece of fiction. It effectively stripped you of your right to manage your own life. I stared at the forged signature. My own father had taught me that honor was the only currency that mattered. Julian and Beatrice had sold mine for the price of a luxury car. They're moving faster than we thought, Vesper, Silas warned, leaning forward. They didn't just want the house. They've filed for a life insurance acceleration. Because you were declared dead in a war zone, and now mentally incompetent, upon your miraculous return, they're trying to claim the $10 million payout from Thorn Medical Research. The room felt small. My father had built Thorn Medical Research from nothing. It was his legacy, and it was supposed to be the foundation for a new neurological wing at the city hospital. They're trying to erase me so they can liquidate the company, I realized. My voice was a low, dangerous rasp. Beatrice never cared about the research. She just wanted the silk robes and the Tulum vacations. If you go to the police now, Julian will use that forged psych report to have you committed before the first witness is called, Silas said. He's got a mental health warrant sitting in a drawer, ready to go. If you step 1 foot in a public court without a counterstrike, you're going to wake up in a padded room. I don't plan on going to a public court, I said, a predatory smile touching my lips. I plan on going to theater. The next day, the ghost began to haunt. I knew Beatrice's schedule. Every Wednesday at 2 p.m., she visited an elite, members-only spa to spend my money on gold leaf facials and champagne. I didn't intercept her. I did something much more psychological. I used my remote access to the mansion's smart home system, a system Julian thought he had wiped. As she sat in the steam room, I triggered the house's internal intercom from my laptop. "Beatrice, the silk is a bit tight on you, don't you think?" My voice, distorted by a digital filter, echoed through the empty marble halls of the house she thought she owned. I watched her on the hidden security cameras I had installed years ago for patient privacy. She jumped, her champagne glass shattering against the tile. "Who's there?" she shrieked, clutching the robe, my robe, to her chest. "You forgot the first rule of neurosurgery, B," I whispered through the speakers in the master bedroom. "Never cut into something you don't know how to close." "You," and Julian opened a vein. "Now, you're going to watch the fortune bleed out." I cut the feed. Panic is a powerful sedative for the brain. It makes people do stupid things. By that evening, Julian was at Dr. Graves' office. I followed him in a nondescript gray sedan. He was frantic, his expensive cashmere sweater stained with sweat. He needed Graves to double down on the incompetence filing. He needed me locked away before the national security hold on the accounts drew the attention of the federal auditors. I waited in the shadows of the parking garage. As Julian sped away, I stepped into the elevator. Dr. Graves was packing his bags when I entered his office. He looked up, his eyes widening behind thick glasses. "We're closed. You need an appointment." "I'm not here for a checkup, Sterling," I said, closing the door and locking it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I walked toward him with the same clinical detachment I used when removing a tumor. "I'm here to discuss the acute combat-induced psychosis you diagnosed me with. Since you've never met me, I figured we should have our first session." You're Vesper Thorne," he stammered, backing into his desk. "Julian said you were. He said you were dangerous." "I am a neurosurgeon, Sterling. I know exactly where the vagus nerve is. I know how to make someone feel like they're having a heart attack without leaving a single mark on their body," I said, pulling a small, surgical-grade syringe from my pocket. It was empty, but the sight of it made his knees buckle. "I have the recordings of your phone calls with Julian," I lied. It was a tactical bluff, one I'd learned from the interrogators in Kyrgyzstan. "I have the wire transfer records of the $50,000 he paid you. You have two choices. You can go to prison for federal medical fraud and conspiracy to commit identity theft, or you can give me the corrected evaluation." "He'll kill me."
Graves Vimperez.
"Julian is a coward who cries when his credit card is declined," I countered, leaning over his desk until my face was inches from his. "I am the woman who survived a war zone. Who do you think you should be more afraid of?" 10 minutes later, I walked out with a notarized affidavit. In it, Dr. Graves confessed that the previous evaluation was fraudulent, commissioned by Julian and Beatrice under duress and bribery. But I wasn't done. The strong female protagonist doesn't just clear her name, she destroys the infrastructure of the betrayal. I returned to my motel and opened a second secure line. This one went to the Federal Medical Board and the IRS. "I'd like to report a massive case of inheritance fraud and money laundering involving Thorne Medical Research," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I have the signatures. I have the bank trails. And I have the bodies, metaphorically speaking." As the night deepened, I watched the mansion through the lenses of my tactical binoculars from a nearby hill. The lights were flickering. Julian and Beatrice were arguing on the balcony, their voices carrying in the thin, cold air. The new start they had bragged about was rotting from the inside out. They had used my love for my family as a weapon. They had used my service to my country as a weakness. They thought they had locked me out of my own life. They didn't realize that I didn't want the house anymore. I wanted the justice that only a war machine could deliver. I looked at the rusted service medal sitting on the dashboard of my car. The same one the sources mentioned was tossed in the mud. I picked it up, the cold metal biting into my palm. "Honor is everything else," I whispered, echoing the words of the major from the video. The storm was coming, and for Julian and Beatrice, there was no shelter in the world that could protect them from the scalpel I was about to drop. Phase 2 was complete. The siege was no longer invisible. By morning, the walls of their stolen paradise would begin to crumble, and I would be there to watch the foundation crack. I opened my tactical notebook and drew a thick, red line through Dr. Graves' name. Next on the list, the courtroom revenge. I closed my eyes for exactly 4 hours, my breathing rhythmic, my heart rate a steady 60 beats per minute. A surgeon needs her rest before the most difficult part of the procedure. Tomorrow, I would walk into the light, and they would finally realize that the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who has already been declared dead. The motel room felt like a concrete bunker, the air thick with the smell of cheap bleach and the low, incessant hum of a failing refrigerator. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the thick manila envelope that had been shoved into my chest by a process server only minutes ago. My hands didn't shake. In my line of work, reconstructing the delicate pathways of the human brain, tremors are a death sentence. Here, in this war of blood and betrayal, they were a luxury I couldn't afford. I ripped open the seal. The paper was heavy, official, and drenched in malice. Petition for permanent conservatorship and mental guardianship, the header read in bold, uncompromising black ink. My eyes scanned the allegations. They were a masterpiece of character assassination. Julian and Beatrice hadn't just stolen my house. They were trying to lobotomize my legal existence. According to the forged civilian medical reports attached, I was suffering from acute delusional paranoia, permanent cognitive dissociation, and violent combat-induced psychosis. They claimed I was a danger to myself and others, a broken woman who needed to be protected by her loving husband and devoted sister. A small, handwritten note fell from the stack of legal jargon. I recognized Julian's elegant, practiced cursive on a piece of yellow legal pad. "Vesper, we're doing this because we love you. You're very sick from the war, and you're not thinking straight. Just hand everything over so your family can take care of you. We forgive you for the scene at the house." My jaw locked, so tight I felt the bone pop. The sheer, suffocating arrogance of the man was a physical weight. He had left me to die in a war zone, moved my sister into my bed, and now he was wrapping his toxic greed in the cheap cloak of family forgiveness. He didn't want to help me. He wanted to lock me in a psychiatric ward so he could liquidate Thorne Medical Research, my father's legacy, without a single person to stop him. They thought they were playing chess. They didn't realize I had already rewritten the rules of the game. 24 hours later, I didn't drive to a lawyer's office. I drove to a high-security facility on the edge of the city, the Apex Military Medical Command. I walked past the civilian intake desk, ignoring the long lines. I flashed my black site consultant identification to the armed guard at the inner gate. He snapped to attention instantly, his eyes widening at the clearance level glowing on his scanner. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice dropping into a respectful tone. "The chief medical officer is expecting you." In the sterile, white-walled examination room, I didn't sit for a 5-minute chat. I demanded a psychiatric evaluation. I sat through 6 hours of grueling cognitive tests, stress response simulations, and deep scan neurological imaging. I wanted a bill of health that was unbreakable. When the lead military psychiatrist, a man who had seen more broken soldiers than anyone in the country, finished reviewing the data, he looked at me with a mixture of awe and grim respect. "You're not just sane, Dr. Thorne," he said, pressing a heavy, federal red wax seal onto the folder. "You're functioning at a cognitive level that most people can't even comprehend. This evaluation is signed by 3 board-certified military specialists. If anyone calls you unstable after reading this, they're committing perjury on a federal level." I took the folder. The heavy artillery was now loaded. That evening, I logged back into the mansion's internal security feed. I watched them. Julian and Beatrice were in the formal dining room, the one with the crystal chandelier I'd bought in Prague. They were drinking a bottle of my $500 vintage Bordeaux, laughing. Julian was showing her a brochure for a private jet charter. "Once the judge signs the order tomorrow," Julian said, his voice oily and confident, "we can move the Thorn patents to the shell company in the Caymans. She'll be in the ward, and we'll be in the air." I watched them toast to my destruction. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold, predatory clarity of a surgeon about to excise a tumor. They were toasting to a fortune that was already being dismantled, brick by digital brick. I turned off the monitor and looked at the clothes I had laid out for the hearing. I didn't choose my tactical gear. I didn't choose a power suit. I chose a plain, slightly oversized gray dress and a simple white cardigan. I wore flat shoes and no makeup. I needed to look like the weak prey Julian had described in his petition. I needed him to feel so superior, so untouchable, that he would unleash his full cruelty in front of the judge. "The best trap," I whispered to the empty motel room, "is the one the victim walks into willingly." The morning of the hearing was gray and suffocating, the sky over the federal courthouse a bruised purple. I walked into the courtroom, hunched slightly, my eyes downcast, clutching a worn leather purse. Julian was already there, looking like the picture of a grieving, concerned husband in a custom-tailored navy suit. Beside him was a slick, strip-mall lawyer named Marcus Thorne, no relation, though he acted like he was part of the spoils. Beatrice sat in the front row of the gallery, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, pure theater. The judge, the Honorable Arthur Sterling, was a man with a face like carved granite. He looked at me with a flicker of pity that I forced myself to endure. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Sterling barked, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You are requesting a permanent conservatorship over your wife, Dr. Vesper Thorne, based on claims of severe mental incompetence and combat-induced psychosis. Is that correct?" "It is, Your Honor," Julian said, his voice cracking with a perfectly practiced sob. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She's a disgrace to her profession now. She's bringing the diseases of the war zones back into our home. She's delusional, paranoid, and she's already threatened my life and her sister's. We just want her to get the help she needs." His lawyer stepped forward, sliding a stack of medical records onto the bench. "These are the evaluations from Dr. Sterling Graves, Your Honor. They clearly state that Dr. Thorne lacks the capacity to manage her own affairs." The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the forged documents. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I could hear Julian's steady, arrogant breathing next to me. He thought he had won. He thought the crazy bitch was finally silenced. Judge Sterling's expression didn't change for a long time. Then, very slowly, he took off his glasses and threw the forged records onto the table with a look of pure, unmasked disgust. "Are you an absolute fool, Mr. Thorne?" the judge growled. Julian froze. His smug expression flickered. I don't understand, Your Honor." "I am holding a counter-submission," Judge Sterling said, picking up the folder I had provided earlier that morning, the one with the red wax seal. "This is a Class A psychiatric clearance from the Apex Military Medical Command. It is signed by the Chief of Staff and 2 senior neurological evaluators. It confirms that Dr. Vesper Thorne is not only in peak mental condition but has been serving as a high-level intelligence consultant for the Department of Defense for the past decade." The oxygen seemed to leave the room. Julian's face turned the color of curdled milk. Beside him, his lawyer took a physical step backward, sweat instantly soaking his collar. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice dropping an octave, "this evaluation confirms Dr. Thorne's status under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, SCRA. Are you aware, Mr. Thorne, that transferring property deeds or altering financial assets while a service member is on an active mission is a federal felony?" "Your Honor," There must be a mistake, Julian stammered, his voice rising in a panicked pitch. The only mistake, I said, standing up. I didn't look like the weak woman in the gray dress anymore. My spine was a rod of steel. My voice rang out with the authority of a woman who had commanded operating theaters in the middle of a war. The only mistake was thinking that because I saved lives, I didn't know how to destroy yours, Julian. I walked toward the plaintiff's table, closing the distance until I was inches from him. The civilian camouflage was gone. The war machine was fully online. Your Honor, I stated, locking eyes with the judge. I submit Exhibit D, a preliminary federal investigative report from the FBI. It details 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of identity theft, and illegal seizure of assets totaling $4.2 million from Thorne Medical Research, all conducted by Julian Thorne and Beatrice Thorne Blackwood while I was deployed under classified orders. Behind the table, Beatrice's knees gave out. She collapsed into the wooden gallery bench with a hollow thud. Julian stood frozen, his index finger, the one he had pointed so aggressively at me, now shaking uncontrollably. Sophia? Vesper, please, Julian choked out, his voice cracking. He actually pressed his hands together in front of his chest. We're family. We're blood. Don't do this. I looked at him, and for the first time in 14 months, I felt nothing. No love, no anger, just the cold satisfaction of a job well done. Blood is biology, Julian, I whispered, the words carrying perfectly across the silent courtroom. Honor is everything else. You cut that tie yourself the day you threw my mother's scarf in the trash to steal my paycheck. From this exact second forward, I am not your wife. I am your prosecutor. Judge Sterling didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a deafening crack. The petition for conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice, the judge barked. Bailiff, take Mr. Thorne and his legal counsel into temporary custody. I am transferring this file directly to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 armed federal marshals walked down the center aisle. As they clicked the heavy steel handcuffs around Julian's wrists, click, clack, the sound was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. He looked back at me, his eyes wide and pathetic, silently begging for mercy. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had crushed them. But as the marshals led them away, I knew the surgery wasn't over. The tumor had been removed, but the dark family secrets that had fueled Julian's greed were still buried deep. There was one more person I needed to find, someone who had helped Julian orchestrate the fraud from the inside of my own company. I walked out of the courthouse and into the cold rain. Phase 3 was complete. The courtroom revenge was absolute. But in the shadows of the Thorne legacy, a new enemy was waiting. The heavy oak doors of my mansion didn't welcome me back. They groaned on their hinges like a wounded beast. As I stepped into the foyer, the silence was so thick it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums with the weight of 1,000 unspoken betrayals. In the sources, Major Sophia Brooks spoke of the deafening silence of a war zone the morning after the shooting stops, and as I stood in my own house, I understood that the hardest part of any war isn't the combat, it's the cleanup. The professional junk removal crew I had hired was already methodically stripping the house. I watched as they hauled out black contractor bags filled with Julian's silk shirts and Beatrice's designer shoes, items bought with my hazard pay, the blood money I had earned while dodging mortar fire in Kyrgyzstan. The air in the house still smelled of their presence, a sickening mix of expensive cologne and the stale, lingering scent of my sister's favorite champagne. Rip it all out, I told the lead contractor, my voice echoing off the bare walls. Every carpet, every piece of furniture they touched. I want this house down to the drywall and the bone. I walked toward the master study, my heavy tactical boots thudding against the hardwood floors. Thud, 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 a sound of reclamation. Julian had thought he could erase me with a forged power of attorney, but he was a fool who didn't understand the absolute unbreakable federal shield of the laws that protect people like me. But as I sat at the empty desk, a cold realization settled in my gut. Julian was a coward. He didn't have the intellect to navigate the complex backdoor servers of Thorne Medical Research. He had a partner, a hostile civil target, hiding within my own board of directors. I opened my encrypted laptop and initiated a deep system scan of the company's internal logs. While Julian and Beatrice were busy, toasting to their own brilliance, they had left a digital trail of breadcrumbs. I followed the packets of data until I hit a wall, a series of unauthorized transfers of the Neuralink patents, my life's work, to a shell corporation in Zurich. The transfers hadn't been authorized by Julian. They had been facilitated by Malachi Cross, the head of my legal department and a man I had trusted since my residency. The deepest cuts always come from the people we spend our lives protecting, I whispered to the empty room. Malachi hadn't just helped Julian steal my house. He was selling my research to a foreign military contractor. He was the one who had provided the sleazy civilian lawyer and the strip mall psychiatrist to facilitate my legal erasure. He had turned my service and my sacrifice into a dirty, insane punchline for a bigger payday. I didn't call the police. I didn't file another lawsuit. I called Silas Vance, the retired military bulldog who understood that we do not leave our people behind to get slaughtered by their own blood. Vesper, Silas's gravelly voice crackled over the secure line. The feds have Julian in a cage. He's singing like a canary. He just gave up Malachi Cross. I know, I said, watching the cursor on my screen blink like a rhythmic heartbeat. I'm looking at the patent transfers now. Malachi is meeting a buyer tonight at the harbor. He thinks he can disappear before the federal warrants hit his door. Do you want the marshals to intercept? Silas asked. No, I replied, my eyes turning into razor-sharp shards of ice. Malachi thinks I'm a broken woman crying in the shadows of this empty house. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes he just walked into a tactical ambush. The Seattle waterfront was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and the smell of salt and diesel. I stood in the shadows of Warehouse 14, my spine a rod of steel, wearing my summer whites uniform, the gold oak leaves on my collar gleaming in the moonlight. I wasn't just a daughter or a sister tonight. I was a field-grade officer commanding absolute respect. A second car approached. 2 men in dark coats stepped out, the buyers. I waited. I let them exchange the initial codes. I let them dig their own graves. Just as Malachi reached out to hand over the briefcase, I stepped into the pool of yellow light from the overhead lamp. That's a heavy load to carry, Malachi, I said, my voice carrying perfectly through the cold night air. Malachi froze. The color drained from his face, turning him into a sickly pale ghost of the man he pretended to be. He looked at me, then at the buyers, then back at me. Vesper? You shouldn't be here, he stammered, his voice cracking just like Julian's had in the courtroom. This doesn't concern you. Go back to your empty house. Actually, I said, taking a slow, measured step forward. Click, clack, click, clack, the sound of inevitability. I've already initiated the total financial infarction. The accounts are trying to transfer those funds into were flagged by the FBI 6 hours ago. You're holding a briefcase full of dead data and a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. One of the buyers reached for a concealed weapon. Before he could clear leather, the red dots of 4 tactical lasers appeared on his chest. From the shadows, Silas Vance and his team of war machines emerged, their rifles held at low ready. Drop the case, Malachi, Silas barked, his voice a grumbly bark that signaled the end of the line. Malachi's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the wet asphalt, clutching the briefcase to his chest like a child. He started to cry, the weaponized incompetence of a man who realized the free ride was permanently over. Vesper, please, he sobbed. I did it for my family, my son's tuition. Don't use the word family to justify being a thief. I interrupted, my voice dropping to a cold, flat whisper. Blood is biology. Honor is everything else. You sold my country's secrets and my father's legacy for a bonus check. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed the uniform I wear. I walked up to him and took the briefcase from his shaking hands. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold, calculated clarity of a prosecutor closing a case. You thought because I was a woman, I was a joke, I said, echoing the sneer of my father from the sources. A cash cow meant to be milked. You forgot that you don't survive a war zone by being soft. You survive by being more lethal than the person trying to kill you. As the federal marshals moved in click, clack, to handcuff Malachi, I turned my back on the scene. I walked toward my SUV, the weight of the duffel bag on my shoulder feeling familiar and comforting. I drove back to the mansion one last time. The junk removal was finished. The house was a skeleton of wood and glass. I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the heavy, crushing silence. I had won. The trap had snapped shut on everyone who had conspired against me. Julian was facing 5 years for wire fraud. Beatrice was bankrupt and under investigation. Malachi was heading to a high-security facility for corporate espionage and treason. But as I looked at the bare walls, the question from the sources hit me. Was I actually going to stay here? This house was built on the blind, stupid loyalty of blood, and that foundation had rotted through. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a fixed financial asset on a piece of federal paper. My burner phone buzzed in my pocket. 2 short, synthetic chirps. I pulled it out. Emergency deployment orders authorized. Report to Naval Base Coronado within 48 hours. A strange, heavy physical feeling lifted off my chest. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, the air felt clean and sharp. I walked to the front porch, where the locksmith was finishing the installation of the Grade 1 mechanical deadbolt. He handed me the heavy brass key. "Everything's secure, Major," he said. I looked at the key, then at the empty street. I didn't need it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my civilian SIM card, the one holding the digital ghosts of my family. I snapped it in half, a sharp, satisfying crack, and tossed it into the trash. Sell it, I told the property manager I had hired. Sell the house, the land, and everything in it. Donate the proceeds to the Military Veterans Fund. I'm going home. I climbed into my SUV and shifted into drive. I didn't look into the rearview mirror. I didn't shed a single tear for the blood relatives I was leaving behind in their self-made cages. The road ahead was wide open, illuminated by the sunlit interstate highway. I was no longer the victim of a marriage deception or an inheritance fraud. I was Major Vesper Thorne, and I was finally returning to the only family that had never asked me to sign a power of attorney before they risked their lives for mine. The war was over. The war machine was finally at peace. The jet engines of the C-130 transport plane roared with a primal, rhythmic intensity that vibrated through the marrow of my bones. I stood on the edge of the tarmac at the private military airfield, the wind whipping my hair across my face like a lash. In my hand, I held a single manila folder, the final audit of my former life. Behind me lay the city that had tried to swallow me whole. Before me lay the vast, gray expanse of the Pacific and a mission that actually mattered. In the sources, Major Sophia Brooks spoke of the deafening silence that follows a victory. As I watched the sunrise bleed crimson over the horizon, I felt that silence. It wasn't the silence of loss, but the silence of a clean slate. The surgery was over. The tumor of my biological family had been excised, and though the scar was permanent, the infection was gone. Before heading to the airfield, I had made one last stop at the county jail. I didn't go for closure. I went for a clinical observation. I stood behind the reinforced glass and watched Julian. He wasn't a slick, cashmere-clad architect anymore. He was a man in a bright orange jumpsuit, his eyes wide and pathetic, his hands trembling as they gripped the steel table. He begged for mercy, using the same weaponized incompetence that Beatrice had used on the courthouse steps. "Vesper, please," he had whimpered through the intercom. "We're family. You can't let me go to a federal facility. I won't survive." I had looked at him with the razor-sharp eyes of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. "Blood is biology, Julian," I had whispered, echoing the cold truth I had realized in the dirt of Kyrgyzstan. "Honor is everything else. You cut that tie yourself when you signed my name to a lie. You didn't want a wife. You wanted an ATM. Now you'll have 5 years of state-funded room and board to think about the difference." I had walked away as the heavy metal doors slammed shut with a deafening boom. Now, on the tarmac, Silas Vance approached me, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He handed me a satellite phone. "The property manager called. The house is sold. The papers are signed." "And the proceeds?" I asked. "Directly to the Veterans Neurological Recovery Fund, just like you ordered," Silas replied, a grim smile touching his weathered face. "That fixed financial asset is now paying for the surgeries of people who actually understand the meaning of sacrifice." I nodded. I had stripped that house to the bare drywall. I had watched the professional crews haul away the silk robes, the expensive wine, and the digital ghosts of a life built on blind, stupid loyalty. I had even snapped my old SIM card, the one holding the digital ghosts of Beatrice's manipulative texts, and tossed it into a dumpster. As I climbed the ramp of the transport plane, the weight of the olive-green duffel bag on my shoulder felt familiar and comforting. I wasn't the weak, discarded woman Julian had tried to paint in court. I was a field-grade officer of the intelligence community, a woman who had survived mortar fire and a domestic assassination attempt. I took my seat in the dim, red-lit interior of the plane. I pulled my metal-framed aviator sunglasses over my eyes, cutting out the harsh glare of the morning sun. Around me sat my team, men and women who had bled for me, who had held the line while I was in the operating theater, and who would step in front of a live bullet to save my life without ever asking for a power of attorney in return. "Heading home, Major?" one of my lieutenants asked, checking the seals on his tactical gear. "Yes," I said, a slow, hard smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. "I'm finally going home." The plane taxied down the runway, the acceleration pinning me to the seat. I didn't look back at the suburban skyline. I didn't shed a single tear for the blood relatives I was leaving behind in their self-made cages. The war machine was no longer fighting for a house or a bank account. It was moving toward a future defined by choice, not by DNA. As the wheels left the ground, I felt an undeniable peace. The road ahead was wide open, illuminated by a sun that didn't set on betrayal, but on the enduring strength of a woman who had finally learned that the only family worth having is the one you choose in the heat of the battle. Conclusion. The harrowing journey of Vesper Thorn teaches us that the greatest threat to our survival is often not a foreign enemy, but the blind, stupid loyalty we grant to people simply because they share our genetic code. In the sources, we see a father and brother use the cloak of family love to camouflage grand larceny, identity theft, and a cold-blooded attempt to erase a hero's existence for a paycheck. The ultimate lesson for the audience is that biology is merely a genetic accident, while true family is determined by absolute loyalty and the willingness to protect your blind side when you are at your most vulnerable. You must never allow your hazard pay, the fruits of your blood, sweat, and sacrifice, to be harvested by those who never spent a single night sleeping in the dirt alongside you. The best forgiveness is not a quiet endurance of abuse, but a tactical strike of total severance, protecting your peace and your legacy with the unbreakable federal shield of your own integrity. When the rats realize the ship is sinking, they will always play the family card, but a true war machine knows that honor is a currency that cannot be forged, and the only home worth returning to is the one where your uniform and your soul are treated with the respect they have earned.